Okay, this is the video for Module 10, and in Module 10 you're going to read Spring Chapter 10, and Chapter 10 is a really interesting chapter, I think, and it's very interesting for lots of reasons. First of all, this is when education really starts to mirror a lot of, you know, influences, or education starts to be influenced, I suppose, from the business sector. Now remember, during this period of time, you're talking about a manufacturing-based business sector, and the pursuit of economic efficiency, scientific management, all of this becomes paramount, becomes very prominent, and it sort of what's the word? It oozes over into education from the business sector. If this works in manufacturing, if this works in business as a business model, then it must work in other areas as well. And something that they bring up, or Spring brings up in this chapter, is Taylorism. And Taylorism, is synonymous with that whole idea of scientific business management and that economic efficiency, and how can we get the most bang for our buck, kind of a thing, which makes sense in a manufacturing setting, obviously, as long as you're still talking about worker safety and all of these things. But in education, as we've pointed out before, we've already found that it's a human system, as Ken Robinson said, right? It's not a mechanistic system. So to treat it as such is really, faulty logic. But anyway, so I think Spring does a great job of sort of explaining this time in history, as well as, so you've got that portion of it is going on, in the U.S., 1910s, 1920s. And then as a result of World War I and the intelligence testing that went into sort of deciding who would be officers and who would be, just enlisted men or grunts, as it were, as a result of those intelligence tests and World War I not really lasting, well, the American involvement not really lasting that long, a lot of test manufacturers were left with all of these tests and no audience really to use them on. So of course there's this vast audience that's just waiting for them to use these intelligence tests on, and that's the American public schools. So so the whole idea of intelligence becomes, it's always been debated up to this point, but it really moves to the forefront, and many people in the field at the time believe that it's a very fixed genetic kind of a thing. It's not something that can be changed. The whole idea of IQ comes up. Anyway, and I give you, for this chapter, I give you a really interesting, or not interesting, I try to sum up a lot of the really good main points in my PowerPoint. And along with that, I found some links to some just little snippets, little video snippets about Taylorism, and a couple of links. One of the links is, and you really should click on it, it gives you an example of a common intelligence test at the time. See if you can answer those questions. I know I can't answer most of them, but and then you got to ask yourself, why is this considered part of intelligence? But anyway, so I think that it's important to understand the biases that went into these tests, and what a shock. They're created by middle class, mainstream, white Protestant people, and of course they're going to reflect those ideals and mores and so forth. So then people that don't come from that background obviously are not going to do as well on the test, and therefore be labeled as less intelligent. So anyway, make sure you watch that or view that PowerPoint in PowerPoint mode, and that way you can click on all of the links that I've attached in there. There's a couple of videos, short videos in there as well, that gives a basic rundown of what an intelligence quotient is and how they figure it out, and just it's interesting. And of course, once you have this whole dominance of an idea about intelligence, And, of course, there's a lot of immigration coming in to the country, a lot of different populations of immigrants from Eastern Europe, from, not from Western Europe where they had been coming into this country. And, of course, it's sort of a way for a lot of people to, as Spring says, reinforce their idea that Western European people are more intelligent than, of course, Eastern Europeans, because they're not doing as well on these tests as well. So anyway, it's kind of a important and sidebar in history that we understand where these intelligence tests went, and part of that will be the eugenics movement. And a lot of people don't even know about this. They haven't even heard about this. I don't think I learned it in high school. But it's important to understand, if you take it too far, where it can lead. So, definitely there's a 4 or 5 minute, I think, little video about that as well in the PowerPoint. So, Chapter 10, Spring, interesting stuff. And also, of course, and some of the good things that, come from standardization are that it sort of bled into the teacher training field as well. And, instead of there being normal schools, you start to see more teachers educated at regular universities, getting 4-year degrees. And standardization isn't always bad. It's just if you take it to a really crazy degree, right? Okay, so, and that leads into Ravitch, and it's kind of interesting when the two sort of meet together. Spring and Ravitch are talking about standardized testing and just the focus on testing. That it almost seems like we haven't learned something or learned anything in 100 years, right? So her first chapter that you're going to read for this module is chapter 28, and she basically says that we need to use tests diagnostically and not as high stakes, tools. And she goes into even more detail than she already has about how that's just a faulty problem. So anyway, the next thing, let's see, chapter 29 is, she talks about strengthening the profession. And chapter... I didn't quite get that. Would you like to say? Sorry. Got a new iPhone and I don't know how to use it. So, let's see if I can make sure this doesn't go back on. So anyway, and then chapter 30, protect democratic control of schools. Okay, and of course she'll go back into again discussing how it should stay in public hands, and schools' public monies and public schools should not be in private hands. But then she also goes into the fact that, the federal government has way too much control. It's way too dominant in with regard to how we've traditionally run our schools, and how that is detrimental to the functioning of our schools. So, a lot of reformers, and I think one of the best points she makes in that chapter is a lot of reformers talk about, how we need this right now. We can't afford to wait, and that democracy is too slow. Democracy works slow. It works in increments. It has checks and balances. And, a lot of reformers say that we can't afford that with our children right now. So, let's think about the alternative. So what kind of a government works fast? What kind of a government can work decisively? Authoritarian, totalitarian governments can work that way. And, we have to be very careful of maintaining, certain protections of those checks and balances in our democracy, and certainly in our public schools, which supports our democracy. So it's important to keep all of these things in mind. All right, so then, okay, so there's another interesting little interview about a book from these two authors who wrote about another social science example of how it affects what we think about education and academic achievement. And these two authors wrote a book about their research about the common ideas of, how Asians are superior at academics. And they essentially contradict this concept, this idea that it's cultural. It's a cultural phenomenon. And, they're harder, the moms are harder on their kids, and that's why they get better grades and all of this, and certainly, they don't rule out certain parenting styles, but they do bring up some really interesting concepts. And some of these concepts, of course, we've talked about human capital, we've talked about cultural capital, social capital. They bring up a new concept that I hadn't heard before, and that's called ethnic capital. And so it's a very brief interview of these two authors about their book, and it brings up some of the highlights from their book. And and so another thing they talk about is stereotype promise versus stereotype threat. Intergenerational progress, if you're talking about immigrants that come to this country. So I think it's important to sort of look at what they found, and what, if you go back again to history, in 1965, the legislation that was passed that allowed immigrants from Asia to start coming into the country favored highly skilled, highly educated Asian immigrants. And so what they said is that this already gave a lot of the population that ended up in America sort of a leg up, so to speak. They were already more educated than compared to their comrades in their country of origin, and then they were even more educated than the general population of the United States. So it's not unusual for their children then to be academically successful. But with regard to ethnic capital, they talk about sort of the social networks, which sort of goes back to Putnam and his ideas about social capital. They're kind of related, I think. But anyway, so that's just an interesting little interview that I thought we should talk about and learn about. So then, okay, so after you do all of that, you're going to respond to the discussion prompt. I believe it's about Ravitch this time. You're going to take quiz number 5. And remember, that's going to cover Module 9 and Module 10 information. And then just continue to work on your research paper. And that's going to be due in Module 12. So that's coming up, another 2 modules. Okay? All right, so I will see you in Module 11.